Welcome to the third video on ancient Egypt. Today we're going to look at the first pharaohs of Egypt, as well as the unification of the two lands, Upper and Lower Egypt. But before we get to that, let's talk about the pharaohs a little bit. The term pharaoh was actually not used early on. It just meant king. The term was actually Hebrew and wasn't actually used until the New Kingdom era, which was thousands of years after the kingdom was formed. So if you went back in time and referred to the king as Pharaoh, you might get a few strange looks. Now, pharaohs were regarded as divine. Early on, pharaohs were considered the living embodiment of the god Horus. Horus was one of the sons of the god Ra. Later on, the concept of the pharaoh was more as the son of Ra, and we'll get to that in a few minutes. Now, when pharaohs died, they passed into the land of the dead to be reunited with Ra, and they were accompanied by the god Anubis. Now, there were 5 titles and names used by the pharaohs, because names were very important to the Egyptians. And to represent accurately all the different aspects of the pharaoh, more than one name was needed to accomplish that. And there were 5 different types of names, as you can see below, and we'll go through each one of those. Now, part of the problem with this is if you have 5 different names, that makes it really hard for Egyptologists to identify who is who. So think about this for a minute. Let's say that you're an Egyptologist and you find a shard that has the first name on it, that Horus name you see right there. And then in some other tomb you find another shard that has the 5th name. How do you know who's who? How do you know that the two are related to each other? And so you can tell how difficult it can be to be an Egyptologist. They spend a lot of time connecting all the dots up, and that's probably a lot of legwork. So let's talk about the first name on the list, the Horus names. Those were the earliest names used by the kings. And we see these painted on pottery, mace heads, and literally all over the place, even on the sides of cliffs. Now, the Horus name was written on something called a serek, and that is spelled S-E-R-E-K-H. And I will show you one of those in the next video, so just remember that. And that was a recessed panel that could be found in the early tombs and palaces. And on top of a serek was the falcon god Horus. And you can see an illustration of that on the right. And that represented the early notion that the kings were a physical embodiment of Horus on earth. So the first pharaoh Narmer, who we'll talk about in a few minutes, had a serek that also had a Horus falcon on top of it. So his full name would have been Horus/Narmer. And then the next pharaoh would have been Horus/Aha, who was believed to be his son. And so that's how that works. So you might ask, what happens when the pharaoh dies? Well, the next pharaoh would be the next version of Horus. I guess that's a good way to think about it. A version 2.0 or something. Now, the next name on the list was connected to the 2 ladies. And those were the 2 patron goddesses that we talked about in the last video. The 2 patron goddesses of Upper and Lower Egypt. And of course, they are Wadjet and Nekhabet. And no doubt this reflected the connection between the 2 lands. The pharaoh's basically making a statement here. I am the king of these 2 lands, and no one else rules them. Something like that. I think that's a good way to think of that. Now, the 2 ladies' name was always written after the vulture and cobra images of the 2 goddesses of Upper and Lower Egypt. And so again, those images that we talked about in the last video of the vulture and cobra were very important. Now, the third name was the Golden Horus name, and that's another name that's connected to the gods. And this was believed to have been started a little bit later on, probably around the 3rd dynasty, and it symbolized the king's divinity. Now, the last 2 are the throne and birth names of the pharaoh. The throne name was also connected to the 2 lands, and it stood for Lord of the 2 lands. So again, it's representing the pharaoh's control over both of those lands. Now, the last name was the birth name of the pharaoh, and this is the name that eventually would become the most important. And this connected him to the god Ra. So again, we see this movement away from Horus. So the pharaoh is no longer a manifestation of the god Horus, but is more connected with the sun god Ra. But this did not occur until later on. It wasn't until the Middle Kingdom era that this name became the most used. So again, the idea of Horus as the pharaoh seems to have been replaced by the concept of the pharaoh as the son of Ra, not necessarily Horus as the son of Ra. So that's the difference. So it's actually the pharaoh now that's the son. Now, if you take a look at that illustration on the right, you'll see the Eye of Horus. And that was an ancient Egyptian symbol of protection and royal power from the deities. And you will see this all over the place in all the tombs and palaces. So that was a very, very important symbol. Now, after a pharaoh died, he was worshipped in temples that were built next to his pyramid or tomb. And these could be very elaborate. And so in a sense, cults were formed, and these could last thousands of years. Now, the pharaoh is responsible for the welfare of his people, but even if something bad happened, such as a plague or a drought, the king was considered untouchable to ordinary mortals. So if a petitioner approached the pharaoh, he had to show absolute reverence in every manner. And often you had to prostrate yourself several times before you could talk to him. Now, the kingship was passed on by inheritance from father to son, and generally the eldest surviving son became the next pharaoh. And often the crown prince was given very high positions within the Egyptian government so that he could prepare himself for his future role as pharaoh. And when the crown prince was enthroned as the new king, there were massive celebrations that were held. Now, of course, at court, the pharaoh always sat on the throne, and he was surrounded by his various insignias. He wore a false beard and also had several different types of elaborate headdresses. And he would have been surrounded by all of his servants and officers. So this was very much a royal king in every sense of the word. Now, you will remember in the last video we talked about the red crown of Lower Egypt and the white crown of Upper Egypt. Now, after the two kingdoms were unified, the two crowns were merged into the double crown of Egypt, which you can see right here. And what I find interesting here is that the double crown retains the original attributes of both the red and white crown. It's kind of a best of both worlds, if you want to think of it like that. And so similar to the two ladies, this also symbolizes the merging of the two kingdoms. And another way I like to think of this is if you're trying to unify the two lands and get everybody behind you, what better way to do that than to keep all the original characteristics of both crowns? And so now we can talk about the first pharaoh of Egypt. So let the controversy begin. Who is the first pharaoh? There are three central figures in Egyptology. There is Menes, King Scorpion, and Narmer. Now, you remember we talked about Manetho a few videos ago, and he was the ancient historian of Egypt. He listed Menes as the first pharaoh. But there's a big problem here. Not a single shred of archaeological evidence has ever been found that indicates Menes was the first pharaoh. So the first question that comes to mind is he a historical person? And where on earth did Manetho come up with his name? Now, there are artifacts for the two other figures, King Scorpion and Narmer. And so they are backed up through archaeology, but Menes, as I said, is not. But that hasn't stopped the debate. There's been a lot of it, especially over the last century. And so here are some of the questions that have been debated. Is it possible Menes and Narmer are the same person? And maybe Manetho had access to some documents and this was some sort of nickname for Narmer? Who knows? Some even believe it's possible that Scorpion, Menes, and Narmer are all the same person. Or that Scorpion and Narmer are the same person and Menes is just a fictitious name. But the generally accepted notion is that Scorpion came first in the late stages of the pre-dynastic period, and it was Narmer who unified Upper and Lower Egypt, morphing it into one entity, ancient Egypt. And I will talk about the archaeological evidence in the next two slides that backs this up. But it's still controversial to some degree. Less controversial today, I think, but certainly there's some controversy. So I don't want to give the impression that it's set in stone. No pun intended there. And of course, we should always be reminded that this was a very, very long time ago. 51 centuries ago. And let's think about that for a second. 51 centuries ago. You are closer in time to Julius Caesar than the original pharaohs were. That's just how long ago this was. Okay, so let's take a look at King Scorpion first. Now, a key piece of archaeological evidence was found, and this dates to around 3100 BC. And you can see the mace head right here on the right. Now, if you take a look here at a close-up, you can see Scorpion is wearing the white crown of Egypt. But there's no other depiction on here of him wearing the red crown. So the implication here is that he was the king of Upper Egypt, but not the king of Lower Egypt. And you can see here one of these scorpions that he's associated with, thus the name Scorpion King. So I think it's fair to say that he was likely the last king of Upper Egypt. Now, if you take a look at that mace head again, you'll see here this very large fragment that's missing. So it's kind of tantalizing to think about what might have been there. Is it possible there was a depiction of him here with the red crown? I guess we'll never know unless that missing fragment is found someday. Okay, let's take a look at the archaeological evidence showing Narmer as the first pharaoh. Now, the major find is known as the Narmer Palette, and that's this large dark green slate that you can see here on the right. Now on the left you can see Narmer is wearing the white crown of Upper Egypt, and on the other side of the slate you can see he's wearing the red crown of Lower Egypt. And so this implies that he has unified the two kingdoms because he is wearing both crowns. And you can see even the Egyptians had gratuitous violence in their media of the day, which is of course carving into stone. In the image on the left, he's grasping one of his prisoners and he's either threatening him or about to strike him. And you will also notice, and this is typical of the way the pharaohs are portrayed, Narmer is larger than everybody else in this scene. Now on the right you can see there's some sort of parade going on, but what that parade's for is not really known. But if you take a look over here on the right, you can see all these decapitated enemies. Now as I said, is this some sort of victory parade? Is this the parade in which he unifies Upper and Lower Egypt? Who knows? But I think it's safe to say that Narmer is indeed the very first pharaoh of ancient Egypt. Okay, that's going to do it for this video. In the next video, we will begin to take a look at the very first dynasty of ancient Egypt.